Please feel free to indicate your preferred gender pronouns if you want to. With that being said, I would like to invite the Prime Minister. And let me check if the recording is ready. All right. Yeah, PM, whenever you're ready.
Oh, the recording started?
I don't think it has started actually. OC, can you start recording?
Oh, okay, cool. Okay. Kavindra, PM, POIs by chat, please. Panel, let's be very clear about what changes as a result of this policy. Currently, Petros owns all the oil wells in Malaysia, and they sell that oil to Petronas, who in turn exports this and gets all the export revenue, of which they give 5 to 20% of the revenue back to Sarawak, which means Sarawak has no bargaining power in this because there is no competition. Petronas has exclusive rights to the oil in Sarawak, which means they have a monopoly buying power and therefore get to dictate the amount of revenue that goes back. The change that we make is that Petros currently takes over the selling of the oil from the oil wells that they currently own, which means they take the oil and sell it to the domestic markets, sell it to Malaysia, as well as export the oil to Southeast Asia and Japan, so the biggest markets for Malaysian oil. 3 arguments from opening government. The first argument is, well, why is this actually just better for Sarawak? Because primarily they just get more revenue insofar as they get the direct export revenue from selling the oil. And they get quite a lot of it because 75% of the oil in Malaysia is currently located in Sarawak. Oil prices are currently quite high as a result of the Russia-Ukraine war, for example. And Southeast Asian and East Asian countries are currently quite dependent on Malaysian oil, which means you're likely to get more money than just the 20% that you get in status quo. But second, it's also because Petronas's current customers are likely to still buy oil from Petros, because Petronas is unlikely to have access to enough oil to be able to sell to countries like Japan or Southeast Asia at the point at which they lose access to the oil, which means that but also, it means that countries like Japan are likely to still keep buying oil from Malaysia because as a result of geographic proximity, it's still likely to be cheaper than importing oil from, say, the Middle East, which is why the consumer bases that currently exist for Petronas are still going to exist for Petros as well. This is important. Insofar as Petros is state-owned, it means that that revenue now goes to the state of Sarawak and Sarawakian government, which means they now have more money to do things like build infrastructure or give people welfare. This is particularly important because A, Sarawak is often ignored by the Malaysian federal government insofar as Sarawak is a majority Chinese province that's heavily discriminated for by the Malay majority government as a result of Bumiputra policy, but also because of geographic segregation that's related to sympathy for people in Sarawak among the capital in Kuala Lumpur, at the point which people just don't see the kind of poverty that exists there. And as a result of wealth concentration in like central Malaysia. But also, it's because Sarawak was stripped of its oil rights after the 1969 Chinese-Malay riots, and at the point at which they were forcibly denied the rights to their own oil. I mean, just principally giving them back that autonomy is a compensatory and right thing to do in this. The second argument is to explain why this is likely to be done well. And I think the reason for why Petros can continue efficiently extracting and selling oil from current Petronas installations is because A, the infrastructure already exists to mine and drill oil. The infrastructure to explore for new oil wells already exists. Sarawak just takes over. It's like Petros will just take over it. Second, skilled labor currently exists. Insofar as Petronas currently employed many Sarawakians who were trained by Petronas, these people would just move over and work for Petros once Petros takes over. But also many executives who currently work for Petros are former Petronas executives who are also exposed to the kind of business practices and processes that Petronas had. Thirdly, it's also because Petros has been preparing for 7 years now and has established systems and good management practices to ensure they can do this efficiently. 4, it's because they also take over Petronas's trade relationships. Insofar as existing customers value the cost effectiveness of buying oil from Malaysia, these customers like Japan or Cambodia or Vietnam, for example, are going to just move over to Petros at the point at which they get same access to oil at the same price. This means that Petros is likely able to extract and sell oil efficiently, and therefore the cost of oil and cost of extracting oil is unlikely to rise. But additionally, we also think that the price of oil within the Malaysian domestic market is likely to reduce. And the reason for this is that currently Petronas has a monopoly insofar as the sole oil supplier into the Malaysian domestic market. But at the point at which Petros also enters the equation, you create competition within the domestic market that would then likely drive down prices within the domestic market. This is important because it makes oil just more accessible to people within Malaysia, which means poorer people can access more oil to be able to benefit their quality of life, which is a good impact in and of itself. The third argument from opening government is about how this actually benefits Sarawakian autonomy. But before that, any POIs? Closing.
Yeah,
Three.
sure. Point.
Yeah.
I'm really unclear why, like, you think that people won't buy from the Middle East, given especially that current oil prices are particularly low, indicating that there is a that there's a shortage in demand rather than supply.
Oil prices are quite high as a result of not being able to buy Russian oil. But more importantly, it's just a geographic proximity, right? Like oil from the Middle East has to be shipped for far longer distances with transport costs, as well as instability in the Middle East makes it an uncertain supply. The fact that you have a stable supply of oil within Southeast Asia means why it's more appealing to countries like Japan or other Southeast Asian nations to buy from Malaysia. Okay, let's talk about why you get more autonomy for Sarawak. This is for two reasons. The first is that Malaysia is now going to be dependent on Sarawak for oil, which means that because there is very little alternative sources of oil, since 75% of the oil in Malaysia is concentrated within Sarawak, which gives Sarawak a lot more leverage to be able to demand for greater autonomy as they have been doing since 1969 when much of the autonomy was actually stripped away. This leverage means they can likely get more autonomy over things like education and healthcare policies from the central government. But secondly, it just means they have more money, which means they are less reliant on the central Malaysian government for money, for investment, and for welfare. This means that they have money to do things like A, lobby politicians within the central government to give them more autonomy or fund, for example, Sarawakian parties more so they can win greater number of seats within the Malaysian parliament who have more power. But also it means it frees up political capital within the federal government to give more concessions, for example, towards Sarawak at the point at which they are not wholly dependent on the central government for money. This is important because it gives Sarawakians a greater amount of agency. Because insofar as Sarawak is a majority Chinese province, it is often ignored and discriminated by the Malay majority government that historically has ignored its needs and doesn't have any sympathy for its needs. But also, it's because of its geographical distance between Sarawak and Kuala Lumpur. Insofar as it's situated on an entirely different island, is why Malay politicians often have very little information or very little sympathy for the needs of the people in Sarawak. Insofar as the information about what those needs are often just doesn't get communicated. The fact that you give Sarawak more autonomy to enact those policies and more revenue to be able to actually fund many of these policies means that you are able to benefit the citizens the most. Very proud to propose.
I thank the Prime Minister for their speech. Now I invite the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yep.
I'll take POS in chat. Okay. Starting in 3, 2, 1. On OO, we don't support a full takeover by Petros. We would much rather Petronas still be the central body in which the country as a whole engages in transactions, buying and selling of oil and gas. We think that is a will that not only is better for Sarawak's autonomy, but also better in terms of ensuring that the region as a whole is more stable down the line. I have two arguments for you. One, why negotiations of Petronas advocating for why negotiations of Sarawak advocating for higher royalties right now will succeed, and number two, why a complete takeover by Petros is actively bad, all responses integrated. First argument on why negotiations for high royalties right now will succeed. This argument contends with Kavindra's argument that Sarawak will get more revenue on their side. The premise of this argument is that Sarawak being willing to ask for a huger slice of the pie and a huger amount of royalty likely means that they have some sort of dominance or some extent of being able to contribute largely towards the oil and gas pool within Malaysia right now. And that is crucial because we argue to you that parties like SUPP, for example, are involved within the government. And SUPP, by the way, is like the party within Sarawak. So they're involved within the government right now as a result of the coalition and the unity government that happened following the previous general election. So there's a political incentive for the federal government to give that concession to Sarawak because the foundation of that unity government is on the premise and understanding that East Malaysia, including Sarawak, should be given more autonomy in terms of state governments. So there is an active incentive for the government to give you that concession and raise that royalty and sort of like not risk further destabilization of the country, given that it was so difficult for a unity government to be formed in the first place. The outcomes of this are twofold. One, at the best case, the federal government concedes and gives you that full 20%. At worst, even if it's not a full 20%, you still get some level of increase in percentage of the royalty that Sarawak currently receives right now, and therefore Sarawak will still get more revenue. So I think this directly shows, at the very least, that Gov's benefit of like having increasing revenue just isn't true or isn't like exclusive within their side. Second argument on why a complete takeover by Petros is actively bad for Sarawak as a result. I want to first note that there are other states in Malaysia that are also able to provide oil and gas resources for the country. So you look at states like Perlis, Kelantan, Sabah, for example. Petros's complete takeover of the buying and selling process is going to be quite bad because the question therefore is, if you have Petros take over, who will buy the natural gases and oil and gas supply from Sarawak? We will argue to you that Malaysia likely would deprioritize Sarawak in their transactions and purchasing of oil and gas and pivot towards all of these other states I mentioned that similarly have oil and gas resources that the federal government can extract from to begin with. There are 4 key outcomes I want to talk about as a result of this. The first thing I want to note is that Sarawak likely has to sell, like in order for Sarawak to sell their oil and gas, Sarawak likely has to sell them at a pretty cheap price to entice the federal government and like other companies to want to opt into you in the first place. So what happens after that is that the returns that you get as a result don't exactly match up to the kinds of royalties that you would have initially gotten in the very first place. Or B, who compensate for the kinds of disparity? You sell them at really high prices, and even if you do get to sell them, that's incredibly harmful for the kinds of people who are living not just in Malaysia, but specifically within Sarawak, who will suffer the consequences of companies being forced to jack up oil prices as a result of the kinds of like initial points of like price increase that Petros has had to leverage upon in the first place. Uniquely, this harms Sarawakians who are known to be like less economically well off compared to their West Malaysia counterparts, as well as during a time where the world is contending with things like fluctuations and uncertainties when it comes to oil and gas prices as a result. The third outcome, and this directly deals with Kavindra's point on the economy. So I would argue this also leads to Sarawak losing on autonomy. I would argue this leads to Sarawak losing its leverage that it currently has in terms of having some level of autonomy to govern the state separate from federal confinements. East Malaysia, as part of the Malaysia 1963 agreement, as well as agreements between political leaders as of late, have always been accorded the right to self-govern and make governmenting decisions on state affairs on their end. So we say this autonomy can only be actioned in a world where Sarawak has the resources and sufficient budget. We argue that losing that source of revenue stream on GovWorld, given the reasons we outlined above, will diminish Sarawak's ability to govern effectively. So you may have Petros as a body independently from that federal government. The extent to which you can action upon that autonomy, given your decreasing level of money, is incredibly detrimental to the Gov case. And we say because you don't have that kind of budget, that's when people on the ground are likely going to suffer downstream of that as well. Fourthly, this leads to more inefficiency in the end, particularly in the way Sarawak and Petros would engage with like oil and gas price fluctuations in a global market. Because Petros is ultimately just like one body within one state in Malaysia that is duly established and would realistically take incredibly long periods of time to build up the kinds of connections or rapport that Petronas currently enjoys on a macro or regional scale to leverage things like discussions and negotiation processes. Let's be very clear. It's not as if like Petronas will go away entirely within the Gov side just because you have Petros within Sarawak, right? 2 things will happen within the Gov side. Either one, discussions on Gov will get dominated by Petronas, and that's when Petros also loses out in terms of its ability to leverage discussions or earn a higher level of income from its existing source of oil and gas in Sarawak. Or B, Petros fractures existing discussions and you increase the kinds of hostility between Petronas and Petros, and by extension of that, you increase hostility between the state of Sarawak and the federal government, which then leads to more destabilization, which is like incredibly harmful given the kinds of like unity government, coalition government conflict that I brought to you earlier on in my speech. Why is status quo with Petronas good enough under our side? Four main things. One, Petronas is recognized as a national governing body of selling and buying of oil and gas resources. Its reputation is already established. It already has connections on a huge stage that Petros currently does not have. But secondly, Kavindra is right in saying that Malaysia is dependent upon by other countries for oil supply. Precisely because of this, we think Petronas is in the best position to represent Malaysia in those negotiations and in those summit like discussions and meetups. We think successful negotiations between Malaysia by way of Petronas also leads to downstream benefits for Sarawakans as well, given that you get increased levels of stability and just like centralized forms of income, centralized forms of revenue streams, not just towards the federal government, but downstream of that towards Sarawak as a whole. For all of those reasons, I've proven to you, one, that autonomy on job site is tokenistic, but number two, you get exclusive levels of revenue streams that will be able to ensure that you get stability as well as autonomy within the Sarawak region. For all of those reasons,
I thank the Olo for their speech. Now I invite the DPM. Here.
Hello, am I audible and visible?
Yeah.
Great. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. The fundamental issue that exists in OO's case is that they bank their case or they bank their success on the alternative working. I'll start by explaining why this alternative won't work. So the trivial note I want to have at the start of this negotiation argument is that they never tell you what percentage of revenue they actually want to grasp towards. If we take from the info slide of 20%, that implies that they're only taking a fifth of revenue compared to the 100% under our side. So take note, panel, at the start of this argument, at the best case scenario under opposition side, they must prove that our oil prices are somehow 5 times cheaper in order for that case to actually have a benefit in itself. But why would negotiation not work? Two reasons. The first is that there's no incentive to give Sarawak this form of negotiation or form of higher prices in the first place. We think that the negotiations have happened since 2014. It's been a decade. If it has not succeeded, we are unsure as to why there's a current tipping point that's going to be achieved. But the second thing here is that Sarawak, as Kavindra pointed out, has a very high Chinese population. That is to say that it's going to be deprioritized by the Bumiputra government insofar as they want to be Malaysia first. We don't think there's actually good structural reasons as to why this is overturned. But even if and the third thing here is that they don't actually prove how Sarawak has a pressure upon the central government. They tell us that there's a unity government, but they don't actually tell us what exactly Sarawak brings to the table in the form of pressure in negotiations. But the last thing I want to point out here is that even if this argument succeeds, how much are you actually going to get? Because it's very likely that a tokenistic form of support is going to be given by the central government in order to assuage the concerns within these regions. Therefore, it is extremely unlikely that the percentage of income that they gain is going to be sufficient to overturn all of the points that we told you in Kavindra as regards to how economically unsustainable these places are. The last thing that they tell you under this is hostility. That negotiations comparatively are able to have more goodwill. But we tell you that a trade-off is going to be taken by Sarawak anyways, because Kavindra already explains to you why autonomy is particularly important to Sarawak and why autonomy is going to be gained under our side. Therefore, even if there's a slight increased amount of hostility, we think it's far better for these countries, or it's far better for Sarawak in order to gain a greater amount of self-sufficiency and a decreased reliance on the central government, given that it's within their interest as an actor. The second thing we tell you is that the second thing they want to tell you is in terms of Sarawak alternatives. The first thing we want to tell you is that there are few other players within Malaysia to begin with, because Sarawak already has 75% of these oil and gas revenues, and so like the resources and stuff like that, and so therefore there's already a large amount of supply that's given from them. We don't think other players are going to be as strong. The second thing here is that we're perfectly fine with lower prices domestically, because as the side mentions, people are able to benefit from lower prices, and Sarawak still is able to gain revenue. In the comparative, this revenue is still larger than the small amount of pittance that they gain from Petronas. The last thing we tell you is that ultimately the main revenue for these countries are often exports, not domestic. So it's still possible for them to charge higher prices in exports and still be able to profit off of that in itself. So therefore, we think that ultimately Sarawak is still going to be able to benefit. The last thing they tell you is that Petronas is good. Two responses. The first is that it's still the same oil from the same country. So even though Petronas has slightly more reputation, we are unsure as to why people are going to be like, oh, it's a different Malaysia, we're not going to buy from this one. We aren't really sure why this is exactly the case. But the second thing here is they raise against the argument that Kavindra gives you with regard to the Petronas monopoly. Let's let's establish this argument. We think that ultimately, this is not just going to benefit Sarawak, but OG claims a benefit to Malaysia as a whole. The lowest tier of benefit here is that Petronas loses control as a major player for all exports because, as we already established, Sarawak controls 75% of this. We think it's going to be a major disruptor to the Petronas monopoly. This hurts their hegemonic control within the country and also hurts their profit incentives, their supernormal profit, which they've been able to use to sustain their monopoly. Therefore, at the very least, Petros is going to be ultimately able to compete against this and via competition who have an incentive to lower prices, which improves consumer welfare and improves export competitiveness in itself. But the higher tier of benefit here is that other countries will join in. Notice that a lot of other states are looking towards Sarawak as a bastion of autonomy, as a country, especially with their new firebrand leader, as the ability to establish themselves as a more independent and a more autonomous part of the country. Therefore, there's a mass undercutting in the best case scenario of the Petronas monopoly, which I think is significantly better for competition. What are the impacts? Twofold. The first is in a decreased amount of prices, which means that consumers, businesses, and exports all benefit within the country. This generally benefits the Malaysian economy as a whole. But the second thing here is corruption. Notice that Petronas, via the fact that they have a virtual state monopoly, has been able to control prices and be able to control a large amount of scandals within these countries and be able to control a large amount of things from political, like the fact that they are like they have alliances with political parties and stuff like that. Therefore, insofar as Petronas' monopoly is able to be undercut in this way, we're able to cut into these forms of corruption, we're able to solve them, and we're able to drastically reduce the impacts of this corruption in itself. Therefore, at the end of this argument, you will believe that there's a benefit not just to Sarawak, but to Malaysia as well. Before I go on, PY from CEO, yeah.
Yeah, OG suffers from a contradiction in this debate because somehow Sarawak has enough power in order to be able to actually compete, but then it also isn't going to, I guess, sort of make the rest of Malaysia dependent on it because obviously it has better infrastructure. Why would it not do that?
Yeah, sure. So the key response here that you want to note is that by the fact that you are bargaining, you are already putting yourself on the lower foot. That is to say, you are accepting the terms of a lower deal, verified by the fact that they are only establishing for 20% of it right now. Therefore, even though they have the power to do so, the very fact that they are subservient to these states in the first place, or they're subservient to the central government in willing to take a deal, ultimately places them on a lower placing, which means they're going to gain lower profits as a whole. Their side needs to prove how they gain a higher amount, else their side doesn't really win this point. Therefore, at the end of this clash, there's a benefit towards Sarawak and there's a benefit towards Malaysia as well. We also established within our case, and this takes us above closing half because CG cannot extend on this, we prove why this will be uniquely done well under our side. Three reasons. The first is that infrastructure already exists within these countries. The second is that preparation and systems have been in place since 2017. The third is that skilled labor exists, especially from previous companies that have already entered these regions to begin with. Therefore, because of these three reasons, we are uniquely able to still have a functional and effective company in charge of this. The outside cannot just insinuate that they're going to be ineffective. You need to give structural reasons to counteract this. Now, why does outside weigh against the rest of the debate? And the rest of the debate that comes out from closing. The first thing to note here is that Sarawak, even if you don't buy my extension, Sarawak matters the most in this round. They are vulnerable, they are economically poor, they are face economic oppression from these countries for a long period of time. Especially noting, for example, the frame that we brought to you of the 1969 race riots and how they've been deprioritized as a result. Therefore, we think that implicitly they deserve an ability to reclaim their economic destiny insofar as they're able to reclaim the sources and the natural resources and the sources of production that exist within their country. The second thing here to know is that this necessarily outweighs the rest of Malaysia as well. Even if you don't buy my argument on how Malaysia has benefited, we still are able to have the most vulnerable actors within this debate, specifically people who have been directly disadvantaged by the central government and don't have the ability to reclaim this on the opposition side. The third thing we do is that we're ultimately able to prove that it is done well on the outside, and I think that's functionally beneficial towards these places. Therefore, at the end of this debate, recognize that the benefit to Sarawak is massive. There's the ability to gain increased revenue to build things like school, to finance businesses, to finance economic activity within their countries. All of this leads to a greater amount of self-sufficiency insofar as there's more skilled labor, more economic activity, and the ability for the country to flourish even absent of the central government's interventions. Therefore, at the end of this debate, for Sarawak, for autonomy, for Malaysia, please go with OG.
I thank the DPM for their speech. Now I invite the DLO. Here.
Cool. Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay. Nice. Give me a moment. Okay. I'm coughing a bit. Actually, I'm coughing a lot. But just excuse that. It's fine. Cool. So I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Let's do a quick fact check here. Sarawak is not dominated by the Chinese. Penang and Johor has a larger Chinese population than Sarawak. Sarawak is dominated by indigenous natives and Malays that are combined under the Bumiputra status. That's the first thing, which counters the claim that, we are oppressed, because we are not. The second fact check is that we are developing. There are healthy ties between the federal and the state government. The fact that they are still negotiating for the increase in oil royalties, for example, implies that there are still rooms for negotiation between Petronas and the state government within these areas as well. The reason for this is simple, because in the federal government and within the cabinet of Malaysia, there are also regionalist parties within Sarawak that represent the interests of Sarawak as well. In fact, we have ministries that are dedicated to the welfare and the development of Sarawak as a whole. This means that the argument about Malaysia neglecting Sarawak is a false idea that does not stand true in the round. The reason as to why you should believe this is true beyond the above is that I'm Sarawakian, so obviously this is just empirically true. Second, what do we support? We support Petronas being the predominant oil supplier in Malaysia, which means that they're responsible for the distribution of oil to different states, but also manage the buying and selling process of oil in oil-rich states like Sarawak and Perlis, for example. This is as a quick preemption against any monopoly argument coming from Gulf, which I successfully preempted. Yes, it is a state monopoly, so there are still political and economical incentive for the federal government to make sure that the distribution of oil and gas remains equitable towards the state that requires it the most. Because Petronas is not only a political weapon for them to be able to use to garner votes, but also they want to make money off of Petronas, which means that they're likely going to also want to make sure that oil distribution and oil allocation to different states remains equitable as well. How does this takeover then result in inefficiency in the oil supply chain? The first thing to point out is that Petros has, since its conception, been very unpopular in the state of Sarawak. 3 reasons for this. The first is that it's perceived to be a political ploy. The Premier of Sarawak, Abang Johari, announced the establishment of Petros during Sarawak Day as means to mobilize regionalist sentiment. Thus far, Petros still lacks critical infrastructure in the buying and selling of oil and gas. They mainly specialize in the extraction of oil, but never in the buying and selling process and the supplying process of oil to other states. The second is that Petronas and Shell, the two biggest oil companies in Malaysia, have entrenched themselves within Sarawak. Both of these companies existed and set up multiple branches and multiple oil stations across Sarawak before 2017, and the establishment of Petros, and before the establishment of Petros. So Petronas is a very heavy marketing and heavy advertising in the region of Sarawak. That's why people have a revealed preference to go to Petronas and Shell to get their oil. The third is that even as of now, Petros has is filled with various legal battles and legal lawsuits with regards to the validity of it. So there are various court cases going around that challenges the validity of this state enterprise to challenge Petronas, which is another state enterprise. So there's likely going to be a lot of legal battles surrounding it as well. What this first argument does, and what this first argument suggests, is that Petros currently doesn't have the money to develop the infrastructure necessary to supply and sell oil to other states in Malaysia, and even as of now, is struggling with even being a strong competitor against Petronas, because they're specialized in the extraction and the drilling process of the oil that they sell to Petronas, but they don't directly sell it to Petronas. No, they don't directly sell it to external trading partners like Japan and South Korea. What would this complete takeover do? The first is that there are more hostility between Petronas and Petros, because the vast chunk of the profit that goes into Petronas comes from its ability to sell and buy oil to states that are outside of Sarawak and outside of Malaysia. This means that assuming this takeover is actually successful, the likely reaction of Petronas was to both go to the other states to buy and sell the oil, but to continue the legal battle against Petros when it comes to the takeover of this industry and whether or not it's constitutionally valid. The second is that they are ill-equipped to take over the industry, because the industry isn't restricted to a particular state, but various other states in Malaysia that are similarly engaged in the oil and gas industry. So when you do a complete takeover of the buying and selling process for this industry, the question then begs itself: who do you sell that oil to, and can you really make a profit out of it? So this Kavindra wants to build houses and build infrastructure, but the economic argument doesn't stand, because you're in the process of negotiating for an increase in oil royalties. They would have allowed for more infrastructure building in Sarawak. They would allow for more capital to go to it as well. That's correct. Oil is valuable. So even getting 5% of the oil or royalties, or getting 10% of it, for example, is already good enough for you to be able to develop a lot of Sarawaki infrastructure. This OG team doesn't explain the money-making process. Because if the prices are driven down to be made more accessible, as Kavindra said, then the profit margins of Petros are going to be cut down significantly as well. So the prerequisite to this analysis was actually getting the revenue in the first place. So correct, that revenue 100% goes to Sarawak. I concede. The problem is they don't prove how you get that money in the first place. The third bypasses this money and profit idea coming from Kavindra, because it's a numbers game that's quite speculative. So the supply and demand for oil and the pricing of oil coming from OG is unclear. Like, I don't know whether or not you're going to make money out of it. The only mechanism for this was Japan and South Korea will buy from Petros. This is fake because the federal government still has power and control of the broad overarching external trading policy with other nations. The likely reaction of the federal government was to significantly limit and restrict the trading partners that Petros can trade with externally. So the export partners that Petros will have is just non-existent because under the federal list, Malaysia still controls the export and import policies that every other state would have, which means that even if Sarawak is autonomous, it is still under the purview of the Malaysian government and the Malaysian export policy. Before that, sure, OG.
So surely they have an incentive to let Petros export because a percentage of that money goes towards the central government as well, which the central government can benefit from.
No, so it doesn't go to the central government. I don't know why, because your argument is that it goes fully to Sarawak to develop its infrastructure. So you don't prove as to why that money really goes to Malaysia, but also like it's on scale lah. So even if the money goes to Malaysia, it's a very small chunk of the money compared to our side of the house. Sure, 5% of oil royalty goes to Sarawak, but we already argue that because of the developing nature of Sarawak, 5 to 10% is already enough as well. So it's like on a scale lah, like the scale. Yeah. The last winning pathway here is the weighing of certainty. It is unclear whether or not this complete takeover would have led to money trickling down to Sarawak, but the oil royalties are a certain form of revenue they can squeeze from the federal government. Politically, this is harmful because the complete state, you can have a complete state takeover, but the federal reaction to the takeover leads towards hostility. So you lose out on any room of negotiation and goodwill that you currently have right now. And it is crucial because the regionalist parties in Sarawak are super influential. Who forms the next Malaysian government is dependent on who can form a coalition with the Sarawakian party. What this means is that there are a gradual process to increasing the oil subsidy. Why is a complete takeover politically unacceptable? The first is that it emboldens secessionist sentiments in this area, which means they advocate for more and more autonomy to the point that you get independence. Second, you lock out a substantial chunk of money that goes towards the Malaysian economy as well. The last is that you don't need oil. Sarawak has other reasons to want to develop. Like they say themselves, they want to reduce dependency on the federal government. So there are other reasons for you to diversify the economy and find other ways to make money as well. They don't prove why this is the only way for you to make money. There are other ways that doesn't require a full takeover. That team doesn't prove it.
I thank the DLO for their speech. Now I invite the member of Gov here.
Hello. Am I audible and visible?
Yep.
Okay, beautiful.
Wait, can you hear?
My mic is unmuted. Okay. POIs in chat, please. Preferably from opening, but if not from closing, it's fine as well. Starting in 3, 2, 1. For decades, Abang Johari, the Premier of Sarawak, has waited in the wings of Barisan Nasional, waiting for the moment he can finally stand up for his fellow Sarawakians, when he can finally reclaim the self-determination they were promised in 1963. After, 40 years in politics, his moment has finally come. This is the moment where Sarawak finally matters at the national level. I don't think Abang Johari should let this opportunity slip away. 2 extensions, firstly on the principle, secondly on urgency and why we solve the urgency. But before that, some extraneous rebuttals on why this is likely to be done well. I think that Raymond and I think Malaya gives us some good reasons why they won't be done well. Unfortunately, I think OG is actually still ahead on this. What does OG actually do to already win this clash? First of all, they tell you that infrastructure is transferable and skills are transferable because your Petronas execs and Petronas engineers will just become Petros engineers and Petros execs. because they still live in Sarawak and there's no other opportunity if you want to be an oil and gas exec in Sarawak. So they're probably likely to stay on. But the second is they already do the weighing for you, which is to tell you that so even if we charitably assume that Petros takes a 50% hit in revenue, if they can take 80% of that 50% revenue versus taking only 20% of the 100% revenue, Petros still makes more money and Sarawak still makes more money. The problem is, I don't think Raymond ever deals with this weighing. The arithmetic is very simple here. I think they already lose this clash. But I'm going to give two further responses to really cement our wing here and provide a responsive contribution. The first is that I'm willing to take a long-term, short-term trade-off, right? So maybe in the short term, all the legal baggles and finagling that Raymond talks about will continue and will hamper Sarawak's profits, will hamper Petros's profits as they figure out how they want to reshape their deals with external partners and everything else. But in the long term, you're still likely to get Petros recovering and becoming almost as good, if not better, at Petronas and selling oil. And this is because of the global trends already mentioned by OG about why oil and gas is an important commodity for Southeast Asia and Asia, because when they transition away from coal, the next alternative is oil and gas. So people need more and more of it, and there's simply a lot closer. We're just a lot closer than Saudi Arabia. There's no reason why Japan would import oil from Saudi Arabia rather than importing oil from Malaysia, right? So I think in the long term, we still win out. We're willing to take a short-term trade-off. But more than that, we tell you that there are also federal incentives to not screw Petros over, right? Because when you screw Petros over, you are not only you're not only alienating an important coalition partner in Anwar's government, you're also destabilizing the entire region where they suddenly hate you. Therefore, I think there's no incentive for the Malaysia government to screw over Petros in retaliation. They're likely to just let Petros do whatever they want, because money for Sarawak is still money for Malaysia at the end of the day. I think we already win this clash. One or two extensions. Firstly, on the principle. Secondly, on urgency. Firstly, on the principle of self-determination. I think the key piece of context that OG misses out is that Sabah and Sarawak, based on my Singaporean history lessons, were promised more autonomy than the other federal territories in the 1963 deal to form Malaysia. This was a constitutional promise that is moral and legal in nature. This constitutional promise was never fulfilled by Malaysia. KL robbed away Sarawak of all its riches and only give them pennies in exchange. And this is a huge principal harm. It's a huge principal harm because it has set back Borneo economically by decades, right? This, guys, is the reason why the Kuching Kinabalu initiative is running this tournament to fund these Bornean debaters who have been marginalized, who have been set back by decades by terribly oppressive policies that never lived up to the constitutional promises. We fulfill those constitutional promises finally by giving them back autonomy, by giving them the money they need to seek autonomy, and giving them the political leverage needed to seek the autonomy. This extension wins the debate because it is a principal extension on fulfilling constitutional promises that is detached from actual practical outcomes. This is why this extension is important. But the second extension, before that, I'll take Malaya.
So this is a lie. Sarawak has an autonomous educational syllabus. We have control over domestic immigration. We have other forms of autonomy that does not need us to have a complete takeover of the oil and gas industry. So this principle is already fulfilled through other matters. You don't fulfill why this is the only way to fulfill the principle.
Yeah, but you know what you don't have? You don't have the money to actually implement all these policies. We give you the money to actually implement all these policies. Moving on to the extension of urgency and autonomy. I know that they proved to you why this was like to work, but they don't prove to you why they must seize this unique opportunity at this unique point in time. I'm going to prove to you the urgency with the characterization. The reason for this is that Sarawak has been historically politically marginalized, right? The Sarawak party has very few seats in the Dewan Rakyat, which is the Parliament of Malaysia, right? They have historically been an unimportant Barisan National Coalition partner. Ahmad never they never really cared about them. Mahathir never really cared about them because their votes never mattered in the parliament. And so they've been historically marginalized politically. But as a result of the most recent elections, they have become the kingmaker in the Pakatan Harapan ruling coalition. Because if Abang Johari pulls out his Sarawak support, and Sabah is likely to follow him anyway, if he pulls out support, the coalition loses its majority. So he has a huge amount of leverage over Anwar. Important to note here is this, we don't know how long this will last, because when the next election comes over, when the seats are given out again, Abang Johari may lose his kingmaker position, Sarawak may lose its important position in national politics. That's why we must take action now. That's why if in the past, Petros tried to pull this funny stuff, BM would have just screwed them over and taken away all the subsidies, taken away all their funding. The reason Anwar can't do this now, the reason why Anwar can't screw them over in retaliation, because Anwar needs Abang Johari in his coalition. That's why this is an urgent opportunity that must be seized upon. We prove urgency in this debate. But the next thing thing I want to prove to you is why we actually solve this problem and why this will actually lead to more devolved power for Sarawak and Sabah. The first gives leverage. I know that Kavindra briefly says this, but Wayland never whips this, and they never actually explain to you why this money is so important. The reason why this money is so important is that Petronas is Malaysia's only company in the Fortune 500. They make a lot of money, and the federal government is hugely reliant on Petronas for funding its budget. And the next thing to note here is that Malaysia is in a federal deficit right now, so they need the money most urgently now. Petronas currently provides a lot of the money, but when you take away 60%, 70% of Petronas' profits, that's when you have huge political leverage over the central government. I've actually proved the economic leverage point by giving you the important context. But second thing is that you create a shift in the political climate, because you prove as Abang Johari that you're willing to create a huge dilemma for Anwar. You show that Abang has got the balls to put his foot on the ground and put his hand at Anwar's throat and say, if you don't give me what you want, I will screw over your government. I will lead to a vote of no confidence in your government. That's the point in which Sarawak becomes in a better position to fight for more concessions, more policies for education and cultural economy, more policies to build the infrastructure that they actually want to build the linkages with West Malaysia they actually want to build, but most importantly, the money to actually carry out. Because we prove the principle, we prove the urgency, and we prove solvency. All these reasons, CG.
I thank the member of COP for their speech. Now I invite the member of OP. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep.
Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think the Gov bench has misread this debate. This is not an active debate. This is a debate on what world is a better world overall. And our case is going to be quite simple. It's going to be why on our side, on opposition, this leads to better development for Malaysia. On a simple weighing of arithmetic, there are more people in every other state in Malaysia than there is in Sarawak individually. So you ought prioritize what is best for the most amount of people. A few things from here. First extension is why this reduces the general access to capital for the Malaysian government and why this is detrimental. On weighing, this is already the most important because it influences their ability to expand and to invest in any forms of infrastructure, in any forms of healthcare, and things that are important to Malaysia as a whole. Three reasons why. First thing is explained is, as CEO concedes, Petronas is the only big Malaysian company. It's also one that is super important. On their side, they get rid of 60% of its revenue stream from Sarawak. The issue with this is this drastically reduces the credit rating of Petronas. The reason why this is important is Petronas currently, because it is a large company that is financially sound because it has a monopoly over oil, has a high credit rating that is higher than that of the Malaysian government of itself. The reason why this is important is historically this has been the main way for the Malaysian government to get investment and build infrastructure is throughout taking loans out on Petronas and using Petronas as a way to expand. On their side, when you wipe off 60% of its assets, Petronas crumbles, Petronas has no more money left, and Petronas does not have access to credit, which is useful to expand, is useful to invest in things, is useful to do the greatest types of reforms and greatest types of development, things that help everyone in Malaysia, already super important here. Second thing to explain is on their side, when you have Sarawak, when you have Petros get invented, it means that revenue is just split between Petros and Petronas, which means that neither company has enough capital to actually attract huge forms of investment or take out huge forms of credit. But then finally, we'll just explain that Petronas in of itself is an asset on the Malaysian government's balance sheet. When Petronas gets devalued by a huge amount, this means that Malaysia as a whole just loses a bunch of its assets, which reduces its ability to debt. The reason why this is important is CEO explains that the Malaysian government is going into a deficit. Debt is important. On their side, debt is more expensive. The government is able to do way fewer things and is able to do way less things, such as infrastructure, such as healthcare, and such as social services. Additionally, if you do care about Sarawak as a whole, it is likely that when the Malaysian government loses its money to the greatest extent, they immediately start cutting off Sarawak because Sarawak was the state that's caused this to happen. Finally, factionalism between Sarawak and the rest of Malaysia harms the overall business environment, which means that FDI and other forms of investment getting to Malaysia overall is dead bad. Over there on access to capital, we win already. We explain that Malaysia is poorer. Malaysia's ability to do anything is worse. The life of everyone in Malaysia gets worse. That is a harm already. Second extension is why Petronas is just more efficient. What this explains is why there's more money being generated by the Malaysian government, and that is money that can be used on their citizens. First thing to explain, there is is just economies of scale. Let's say supply chains, technology, and the ability to attract and invest capital is just higher on our side because Petronas is big opposed to two small companies there. They try to say that capital already exists, but the problem with this is oil and gas capital is highly expires very quickly and does need to be refurbished often. It does need to be upgraded often, and it does need to be improved, which means that on their side, you are unable to improve it as fast. It's more expensive to improve things, and there is a harm there already. But secondly, monopolization in of itself is a benefit for Malaysia. The reason why this happens is when Petronas and Petros exist, they compete with each other on both the buyer side and the seller side. On the buyer side, they end up reducing both of their prices to get better deals with other countries, which is a harm to Malaysia because they're able to sell their oil for less. They have to sell their oil for cheaper than they otherwise would, which means that they generate less money, which is bad. But additionally, on the sell side, it means that their costs of upgrading, their costs of infrastructure are just more expensive, which means that they do have less profit that is generated, and also it means that the access to labor is split. That means that we continuously fighting over where they get workers from, where they get labor from. That means their costs are over higher. This is a huge harm to efficiency and a huge harm to the amount of money Malaysia gets as a whole. Also, they try to say that domestic prices getting lower, but I think the problem with this is domestic prices getting lower isn't necessarily a benefit, as the point that domestic prices or domestic selling of oil is something that goes directly to the government for the government to redistribute, as Petronas is government owned. So it's unclear why this is a benefit, because it goes to the government, which eventually goes back to citizens in a much more equal way there. Third thing to explain here is on principle, because this debate, no team never explains why you should prioritize Sarawak or Malaysia as a whole. We tell you very intuitively that Malaysia is much bigger and ought be prioritized. Why is this? We explain to you that the government bench just lies when they say the majority of people in Sarawak are Chinese. That is a lie. But secondly, we explain that Sarawak already has huge levels of buying power and is the third largest economy for the reason that it has a huge oil market and generates a huge amount of jobs for this. What this explains is there's a bunch of other Malaysian states that do not have these jobs, and people are living in poverty. People are unable to bring food on the table. They're unable to access services because services are underdeveloped there. The problem with this is Sarawak has money. These people do not have money, and that is the greatest form of oppression, where they do not have money to live their lives. They do not have money to live and provide dinner. Finally, we'll explain that the citizens of Malaysia do pay federal income tax, and this federal tax systems was what built Sarawak's infrastructure to mine oil and extract oil in the first place. That's to say, when it's coming from federal taxpayers, which everyone in Malaysia pays for, that every single person in Malaysia does have a right to access the benefit of that federal investment in the first place, which explains why principally they all have a stake in Sarawak and have a stake in Petronas and the money that counts here. But fourthly, we explain on a utilitarian measure, the central government is just better at distributing money where it's needed. You can see where places are least funded, where healthcare would have the biggest effect, and can send money there. Final thing to explain is why, even if you don't believe anything else in the debate, Petronas in of itself is a better investment than Petros. The reason for this is Petronas is currently a market leader in renewable technology and has a unique capacity to invest in renewable technology. This is because it has pressure from international agreements and international branding for it to be renewable, which means that it has to be renewable on an internal level. But secondly, because of its international brand, it is able to attract investment into renewable technologies, and it's able to attract investment from the Malaysian government. Thirdly, it's able to attract the highest levels of skill because it operates on a national level opposed to just Sarawak. What that explains why Petronas is uniquely able to be more sustainable and invest in advanced technology and renewable technology to a greater extent than Petros. The reason why this is important is by CEO's own analysis, the amount of gas and non-renewable technology you can export in the long term decreases as countries shift away from fossil fuels. On our side, we show how you get better investment into renewable technology, which is crucial for the long term health of Malaysia. So proud to oppose.
I thank the member of opposition for their speech. Now I invite the cough whip. You're here.
Hello, can I confirm that I'm audible?
Yep.
Cool, give me a sec. All right. We will first eliminate closing opposition from this round. The faulty assertion that closing opposition rests your case upon is the idea that the federal government will distribute resources equally to all of Malaysia, and so the point in time in which all of Malaysia fails, all the states fail. This is incongruent with reality. You can believe me because I am also, like opening opposition, Malaysian. The reason for this is because the federal government has historically never relied upon the peripheral states in order to obtain a majority to form government. The reason for this is because the majority of seats are concentrated in like places like Kuala Lumpur and heavily in areas that have been heavily invested in by the federal government. This was strategic because this meant that the federal government never had to like care about places like Negeri Sembilan or places like Perlis or places like Sabah, because they could concentrate all their resources in places like Selangor, in places like Kuala Lumpur, and obtain their majority there. This is important because this therefore explains how under their side of the house, the comparative is not all of Malaysia prospers versus only Sabah prospers. It is Kuala Lumpur prospers versus Sabah and Sarawak and Kuala Lumpur prospers, and that's why we win the debate. Firstly, on positioning K-Boon's extension, I'm actually going to spend a lot of time in this debate positioning K-Boon because I think K-Boon gives you three important contributions that take us over all other teams within the debate. I'll flag you when I position when we beat another team. The first thing K-Boon explains is why the status quo is a unprecedented time in Malaysian politics, because this means that smaller states like Sarawak could have the unique opportunity to break away from centuries of oppression. This is hinted at by opening government, but they never explain what this money and what this autonomy truly looks like, what this kind of historical oppression looks like. I'm also going to use this to weigh against the closing opposition case. What this has historically looked like is that this kind of oppression dates back to pre-colonial eras when the West Malaysia, as well as the other states that, as well as Borneo, were colonized by different colonial masters, which meant that West Malaysia was able to get a lot more infrastructure, were able to get a lot more resource allocation compared to Sarawak, where they just plundered natural resources like lumber and oil. This is also important because the point in time in which, for example, Central Malaysia enticed Sabah and Sarawak to join them, they actively told these individuals that they would provide them with a large amount of autonomy. Opening opposition points out in a POI that this has been afforded in the mode of policies. However, what is not explained, what is conveniently ignored by opening opposition is the deprivation of these areas from economic stimulus. What this looks like is, for example, the West Malaysia taking the majority of oil within these areas and only paying them a 5% dividend. It looks like the low standards of healthcare and infrastructure within these areas. It looks like these areas being primarily rural and often incredibly underdeveloped. That's to say that the standard of living as well as the ability of these individuals to get jobs and education is incredibly diminished. So it doesn't really matter if you can set your own curriculum if these individuals have no ability to access these schools, or if the schools are dilapidated in the first place. What we uniquely give them is the ability to have this kind of autonomy, and we are fulfilling this principal promise back to these individuals. Why does this weigh over the entirety of opening, the entirety of closing opposition? I'll respond to closing opposition here. One, all of Malaysia will still be able to, the first thing I'll do to deal with closing opposition is to explain why the majority of the impacts is not mutually exclusive. One, this firm will still pay tax. This means that the money will still go back to the central government. The government can still fund services. Two, it's not mutually exclusive that only Petronas had the ability to take out loans. Now we have two giants. Maybe the ability of these giants, maybe you diminish the ability of one super giant, but you still have two giant firms. They are still able to put themselves as collateral to take out loans. So it's unclear as to why the delta here is significant. But lastly, and most importantly, we tell you that the comparative was not being able to give like infrastructure to individuals in rural states in Malaysia. This was never happening because of the incredibly unequal income distribution and economic distribution of funds within Malaysia in the first place. The majority of this money is going towards KL because the government is actively trying to make KL the next financial hub. They're trying to fund their banking sector, for example. They're attempting to reinvest in their government, for example. And this is why it's important, because this meant that under outside of the house, the comparative is that we finally give Sarawak some autonomy. So why do we beat closing opposition at the end of the day? One, we are not actively reliant upon just Petronas. We explained to you why you have other means, or you have other streams of income, that's to say the banking sector and other producers like palm oil, for example. But second of all, this firm can still contribute towards all of Malaysia because East Malaysia is still part of Malaysia. But second of all, we just outweigh them because it's simply not the case that they are fighting for the majority of individuals. If it's the case that these individuals, if it's the case that they have scale, we tell you why these individuals in Sarawak have been historically oppressed by Malaysia. The point in time in which they promises that they join the coalition of Malaysia were actively reneged upon, when we actively took away their ability to self-govern and the capacity to self-govern, because we deprived them of the ability to fund their own policies in the first place. We restored that autonomy, and that's why we took the debate in the first way. The second important contribution that came out from people is to explain why this is irreversible under outside the house. The comparative that opening up, and here's where I want to deal with the entire opening house in one fell swoop. The entire opening opposition case is premised upon the idea that you're going to be able to ask for more money from the government. Here's why this is unlikely to happen and why we're comparatively better. Boon explains why this is an unprecedented time in Malaysian politics. Now is the time in which you're able to make massive and egregious demands upon the federal government, and Anwar has no choice but to accept it. That's the reason why this debate is even happening in the first place. Is the only reason why Petros has the leverage in order to obtain all the funds in the first place. What this means is that the point in time in which the next Malaysian election rolls around, the point in time in which Pakatan Harapan is actively trying to massively campaign within city areas, for example, in order to get the majority of their votes there, means that Sabah and Sarawak will be pushed out of the coalition government, the point in time in which they got more money. So what we uniquely explain is why the impact under outside of the house is irreversible, because now the point in time in which you have Petros that takes over ownership, you are no longer able to renege upon that. The comparative under the outside of the house is the Malaysian government being able to blame things like economic shocks or having the necessity to reallocate funds in order to stifle Sarawak from the ability to get their 20% returns. So let's deal with opening opposition's best case here. Even if it's the case that they're able to get perhaps even like more money because they maybe get more efficiency, this is short-lived, and the government has active incentives to try to reclaim this, because everything closing opposition says is true and you're massively screwing over the federal government. The government has all the interest to do that. We explain how, one, you no longer have the capacity to do that in the future, the point in time the next election rolls around, because these resources are now concentrated within Sarawak. But second of all, we explain why we are willing to take the trade-off. So even if it were the case that we screw over areas like KL, we tell you that these are areas that have historically prospered from continuous government streams of income, which meant that these areas were not as vulnerable as closing opposition explained. We told you why Sarawak was historically more important. Lastly, why do we weigh over opening government? One, we explain why the impact is prolonged, which means that we take it over them. Two, we explain why the comparative is far, far worse. Last of all, Wheeler has played every single final, and that's why we take it over.
I thank the Golfit for their speech. Now I invite the Upwhip. You're here.
Hi, just checking that I'm audible.
Yep.
Okay. Pronouns he, him. Just put POIs in chat, please. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Firstly, defending our stuff, then on to CG, then on to OG, then weighing over OO. All right. CG has 4 main rebuttal to our case. First is that you won't actually redistribute the wealth, the Malaysian government, so it doesn't actually matter that the Malaysian government is getting this stuff. 4 responses to this. Firstly, that the fact is that this might have been true in the past, but now politics in Malaysia is becoming like a lot more diversified. It has power is becoming, I guess, more centralized, and I think they correctly identify that like right now Malaysian politics there's a very small majority. What that means is that you also have to cater to these other areas. But I will note there just are policies like healthcare that are just good for everyone and can be implemented everywhere. And obviously the government has an incentive to do that in order to rebuild its majority, in order to not have to have like Sarawak in a kingmaker position. Because of that, it is likely to do that. It is likely to do this in a good way. But I'll also just note, Malaysia just is doing like has like developed quite well. Malaysia has increasingly had less and less people below the poverty line. They've increasingly been able to redistribute wealth. They've increasingly become more educated. Obviously, like something's going well, and that's not just because it's being concentrated in all areas, right? They have been able to help these other areas like Sabah, areas like Kedah, areas like Terengganu, that just have not been able to get, that just obviously like Sarawak just cannot address. But in our absolute worst case, just like the areas that are favored by the government do still go down. So in our absolute worst case, like maybe like 5 states under our side get benefited. Their worst case is literally just 1 state gets benefited, right? Just Sarawak gets benefited by this policy. No one else gets benefited. And your main main source of income is completely gone from Malaysia. All right. Secondly, they said that it's actually okay. You have other income streams. Two responses to this. Firstly, these are just not high. Like, as I think is correctly pointed out, Petronas is a massive company. Nowhere else gets even close to Malaysia. Maybe in the future you are potentially able to grow this, but I will note it's much harder to get these things up and to develop these further when you are not able to like take out loans, they tell you. And they tell you that, oh, it's actually okay because you can still take out loans on Petronas and you can also take out loans on Petros as well. Firstly, like Petros just isn't the government anymore. You obviously cannot take out loans on it. And obviously Petronas' size is reduced. But also loans are just more risky to give out now because there's a good chance that one of these firms might fail due to the fact that they are directly competing with the other. As a result, it's going to be much, much harder to actually give out these loans when there's like a 50% chance your company actually fails, and then that loan basically becomes worthless. So obviously they are far, far, far less able to do that. That just means the government is going to be able to raise much, much less capital. Obviously the government is just able to do more. Oh, the final thing they tell you is that the firm pays tax. The first thing is, I think that there are ways you probably can get around this. What that looks like is you probably just give most of this to Sarawak, which is obviously what the government bench also needs for them to have a benefit in this debate. Like presumably this brings in money to Sarawak. But also this tax is much, much lower than obviously the 100% that they are doing now. And like just weigh this, like their side is maybe like 95% of money going to Sarawak, 5% going to like central government. Ours is like the other way around. Obviously the central government is able to just do this better. But and yeah, obviously this tax is just much lower. But I also just don't think it happens. What that just means is that the capital for the Malayan government is just significantly reduced. And this is the primary source. This is what they are able to use to just get revenue, but also take out further loans that help it develop further into the future. This is just something that is going to completely cripple the government in this way. Once that happens, the rest of Malaysia is dead. That's obviously more people, but it is also more vulnerable actors in Sarawak because these places are places that have been like historically disenfranchised. If anyone has a point on that, I'll take that quickly.
So even Petros is a state-owned enterprise. It's owned by the state of Sarawak, which is still an arm of the federal government, has linkages. So they can still raise money using Petros's access to all the massive oil supply the same way they do so with Petronas.
Sure. I just don't think that's true. I think that would have to be done by Safe Sarawak. But obviously, like the analysis I gave you earlier about why it's riskier when you have two companies directly competing with each other, but might fail, that are consistently undercutting each other, still works. Like that still holds. It's obviously still much, much worse. Plus, also their credit rating is split. Obviously, short term, this does result in harm, even if long term it maybe stabilizes. But particularly the short term is much more important right now because that helps future development. They're entering a time of debt as is conceded. Obviously, this point then still stands. This is just a mess point. This is just debate winning for this because all of Malaysia just gets harmed, and I think including Sarawak, as Jehiel tells you. So I think in that way we are able to win. The next thing we do tell you though is we tell you why Petronas is better to invest in. And I would note this is uniquely different to our opening opposition because our opening opposition explains why Sarawak and Petros are bad. What we do is we explain why Petronas is better and more attractive for people to invest in. And I think that just comes ahead, and we're able to explain why Petronas does it well. The final thing is we just give a principle which just gets unresponded to, and I think that principle just does help us win the debate. So overall, I think we are able to win the debate because one, we are able to explain why all of Malaysia just gets much more harmed on their side. Note the empirical fact that Malaysia just has been getting better, that less people are below the poverty line, etc., should just point to the fact that things are pretty good in Malaysia and they are able to redistribute wealth, which is the main attack that we hear out of that side. So once that is the case, we've obviously won the debate. We've also given better mechanisms than ROO as to why you are better able to get oil. You're able to get why you're better able to get oil, why you're better to be better in the future as well because you're more sustainable, and we've given principle justification. Let's move on. All right, closing government. Why did they lose? The first thing to give you is a principle, but then in a POI, OO say, you already have autonomy, and then closing government say, but you don't have the money. So I guess it's not about the principle then, it's just about which side gets money, right? And given that our side does still have money for Sarawak, I think this is fine. The other thing I will note is they say that like currently Sarawak is in the king bay position. What that probably means is alternatively, you just are able to get these royalties through, right? Because you are in this king bay position, you are able to thus get these royalties through, and you are able, because otherwise you can withdraw support from the government. Stuff like that just means that I think you are able to get that through. That means that Sarawak also has a good amount of money under our side. I'm unclear why they then need like even more money. I think it's like very diminishing returns versus the rest of Malaysia who gets like comparatively very, very little. So that's basically CG out because their principle doesn't stand, and their point on urgency doesn't really work because we can use that urgency as well to do good stuff. All right, now on to OG. The way that we beat OG is just for as all of their benefits go up, our harms go up, and they go up more. That is because as Sarawak gets better, and as Sarawak is able to get more and more money, the Malaysian government just gets less and less money. Obviously, that is just incredibly harmful because of the weighing metric we identified. Apart from that, I don't have too much like direct rebuttal. I think they did quite a good job there. It's just that our harms are just like far, far, far more impactful than what they do. The final thing is OO then. I guess the first thing to note is that obviously we just way over them again in terms of scale, which is that we explained the bigger harm in this debate and the biggest harm in this debate by far. But the other thing then I think is that on their own metrics, which are like why Sarawak is, which is what they try to explain why Sarawak would be bad. I think we just do a better job of explaining Petronas is good. And I think that the mechanisms we give you are far more stable versus the, I guess, clash in the opening half over why Sarawak is good. For those reasons, so proud to oppose.
I thank the all for their speech. This concludes the debate. So yeah, thank you for the round. For the judges, let's just move to